Welcome to Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Keith, on a snowy morning in Tennessee.
It is a snowy morning in Oak Ridge. That is for sure. That is for sure. We've got a couple of special guests. Why don't we just get right into it, Ray, and you could give us an introduction.
I am so glad that we have these guests on here today. And Leslie Schover and I have been talking for some while about an article that she has written that that talks about how she came to write a book. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And as a coincidence, the story has just appeared today on the in the Oak Ridge newspaper. And part of her story includes her relationship with Julie Coryell. And I'm not going to do a good job of introducing the two of these ladies. I will tell you, Leslie has a PhD, and then let her talk about herself a little bit and talk about Julie.
Well, thank you, Ray. I actually, by training, am a clinical psychologist, and I grew up in Chicago. And my connection to Oak Ridge is that my parents, who married very young at 19 and 22, and then had a baby soon afterwards, were recruited by Julie's father, Dr. Charles Coryell, to come to Oak Ridge. Now, my dad didn't even have a college degree, but he was a kind of an electronics whiz, self-taught and some technical school, and they were short on electronics people. So my mother was a University of Chicago undergrad and had a friend who was working already at the Met Labs and said to my dad, we need your skills. And my dad said, I already have a war job. I'm working on building speakers for battleships so all the men can hear the commands. And so he said, but I think what we're doing is more important, and I want you to meet Dr. Coryell. So the Coryells invited my parents over to their house for dinner and proceeded during that evening to tell both of them the whole thing. They said that, the Nazis were competing with us to work on fission and an atomic bomb, and that the Coryell group had the mission to produce the first gram of plutonium, and that they needed my father's electronic skills. And looking back on it, I was just kind of amazed because you hear so much about the secrecy at Oak Ridge. But I think that most of the people at X10 who were at the scientist level, and even though my dad was very junior, he mingled with all of them. I think they all pretty much knew what they were working on. So it might not have been, I think, just like the administrative levels at the other buildings, I don't think the secrecy was so absolute. But anyway, my parents had tons of stories about Oak Ridge. I always wanted to do something with them. And before I get further into that, I want Julie to be able to introduce herself, and I think she would do a better job than I will.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm delighted to be part of this gathering. I was conceived in Chicago, and my father always made a point of saying that. My mother also had the wife of one of his colleagues, Esther Davies, wife of Harrison Davies, as her gynecologist. So, of course, she didn't deliver me. She didn't go on to with Harrison to Oak Ridge, but there's, for me, a very strong feminist theme and often invisibility of women's experiences. I mentioned earlier that my mother was a poet, and my father said that she had more poems in print when they married than he had papers. But with the nepotism, she didn't go on to publish, and what she absorbed in understanding, she expressed in a poem called A Picture. I mean, the picture of the only color picture of the Trinity just blast, having that picture on her mantle. And there's a picture on the back of my book of now, if you buy an ebook, I understand you don't get the back page, but here's the front page. So
yes, I want you to know that I have purchased that book. All right. And then when I went to look for it so I could show it today, I can't find it. So I've ordered it again.
well,
it will be here tomorrow.
well, all things in good time. But I was born in Oak Ridge on Christmas Eve of 1943. My father helped design the hot lab. So the secrecy meant that I couldn't understand. I couldn't be told what he worked on during the war. And of course, I heard a lot of talk. My father went to a conference that he talks about in the book, which is his oral history. They went to Canada. And so it was the first week of first grade for me. And my mother explained we were going to Canada at Quebec, and people would speak French, and I probably couldn't be understood or understand the conversation. But we got there, and a little boy addressed me in a store, and I couldn't really communicate with him. And I said to my mother, I thought there were only two languages, English and chemistry, because so much conversation happened in doorways. But I was very jealous of the fission daughters, the isotopes. Isotopes, they were colloquially called. And so after my father stayed on a year, 45 to 46, and then in July of 46 went to MIT with William Ted Martin in the math department, who turned out to be my father-in-law, and Gerald Zacharias, prominent physicist, were the three appointees. And I've learned partly through the math department and my father-in-law's contributions to MIT's academic and intergovernmental relationships that those three men were really the impetus for the government academic links that have shaped the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, our life today. And so I couldn't do chemistry. That was too big a world and too many secrets. So I ended up falling in love with Chinese history, and I majored in Chinese language and literature at Radcliffe, then now subsumed into Harvard, and was just delighted as a 2.5, 3-year-old when we went to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to see the beautiful puzzles of Chinese characters, ideograms, and I wanted to know what they meant. And I continued with a master's degree on the interface of science and politics. It was the start of the Cultural Revolution in China, and putting forth peasant knowledge. Well, my husband was an earth sciences geophysicist, and I managed to study the peasant wisdom of genetics, plant genetics, earthquake sensing, noticing behavior of animals. And so I did a thesis on this interaction of science and policy. So then I married and made a deliberate decision that what I eventually found, we moved geographically from the Boston area to Seattle, Washington for Seeley's work in geophysics. And I discovered women's studies, and I had majored in Chinese for the lack of balance in American education being very Western Europe oriented. And we noticed things like there was a history of the atomic bomb in the history department, but no history of suffrage, women's rights, or birth control, and lots of topics. So I discovered too, Helen Papanek wrote a definition of the two-person single paycheck career. And that really gave me, in China, we talked about have you eaten is the greeting. And then I like your shirt. How much did you pay for your shirt? Well, in our culture, we say, oh, what do you do? And that opened me to learning. For example, my mother was denied a college education by the Depression. Her two older brothers went to college, but there was no money for her. And Carolyn Bird wrote The Invisible Scar. And so this has relevance because part of what I'd like to offer to our conversation is, first of all, how my father's education influenced this openness that Leslie has latched onto and highlighted in her work, in her novel about her parents, and then some of the invisible things that we still don't talk about too much. The numbers of women involved in science, for example, and atomic energy, and now atomic policy.
Julie, I'm thinking too that it might be helpful for me to say a little bit about how I discovered you, because when I first started on my research for the novel, I actually did not know very much at all about what my father did at Oak Ridge. In fact, I thought that he was working with a physics group rather than a chemistry group. And I did know the name of Charles Coryell, and I knew there had been a group. So I started looking online, and then I found Julie's website, and she and Joan Bainbridge Safford published a very extensive book that you showed of interviews with her father. So I started going through that, and for the first time, I really understood what it was that my father did. And he actually was mentioned very briefly a couple of times in the interviews. And in fact, one story that I had never heard from my parents was that on the day of the bombing of Hiroshima, radios were forbidden in the lab because they worried that they could be listening devices for spies. And so my father was a radio buff, and we had a radio at home. I say we, although I wasn't even born until 1952. But the radio was broken, and the lab had some instruments that my dad needed to fix it. So that morning he had brought it in, not to turn it on, but just to fix it. And when the news of the bomb being dropped broke, some of the wives started calling, and they called Charles' secretary with momentary updates about what was on the news. And by then, my father had fixed the radio, and they went ahead and turned it on because that let them listen in real time. So I was really touched to find that story. Maybe it also might be helpful for me to say a little bit about why I decided to write my novel, which is called Fission, a novel of Oak Ridge, and will be published in early January 2026. So I hope listeners will keep that, make a little note on their calendar for when it will be available. But a lot of people think about, oh, the movie Oppenheimer, and maybe people started writing more about the Manhattan Project when that got to be so popular. I actually started before that, and I was motivated by the stories that came out starting in, I think, about 2020 or 2021, about two Soviet spies in Oak Ridge who had previously been maybe known by a very few people in the government, but not widely known by the public. One was named Oscar Sieberer, and the other was a spy named George Koval. And both of them worked in X-10, the nuclear reactor building where my dad worked. They were both maybe a few years older than he was. They were both also of Eastern European Jewish origin, like he was, and they were both electronics engineers. So I thought, wow, I wonder if my dad ever knew either one of them. And on top of it all, George Koval was a radiation safety officer. He was in the special engineer detachment. And my father had actually gotten an accidental radiation exposure, although looking at the timeline, my guess is it was before George Koval actually arrived in Oak Ridge, because I think it must have happened before Charles Coryell designed the hot lab. And that was actually finished before George Koval arrived. So I don't know in reality if their paths crossed, but and I couldn't ask anyone because everyone was all deceased by that time. So that led to a fictional subplot in my novel about a love triangle between the wife in the couple and the spy, who's very loosely based on George Koval, whose life story is told in Anne Hagedorn's nonfiction book, Sleeper Agent, which I would really recommend to anyone who is interested in this period. It's really excellent. The research she was able to do is fantastic. And George Koval was never caught. He escaped back to Russia and was posthumously awarded a Medal of Honor by Putin in 2007. So in my book, the woman in the couple turns him in, but that's a totally fictional subplot.
Oh, well, I'm interested to read that. I think it'll be an interesting connection. As you know, Ann Hagedorn came to Oak Ridge. I gave her a tour, and we brought her here to speak about her book. That reminds me, when yours comes out, we'll want you to come to talk to us about it too.
Oh, excellent.
Is this a good time to try and show that video of
Yes.
Dad? Let me see if I can bring it up. Bear with me just a moment. Let me get everything set here.
While Ray is bringing it up, I can explain that this was a video when my dad was 85, a couple of years before he died, and he was giving a talk to my son's 6th grade class about Oak Ridge, and I got him to tell a couple of his famous stories.
All right, let's see if we can do that. Keith, are you seeing that?
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
We were all in danger of being exposed to radiation, gamma rays, beta, etc. So there was a group called Health Physics that kept us safe. So we all wore 2 little fountain pen gauges were little ion chambers that got charged up in the morning, and then they read at the end of the day how much charge had leaked off, and that would measure how much radiation you'd received. They had 2 of them in case one of them just was leaky. If the 2 readings didn't agree, then they'd know it wasn't real. And then we also wore what people still wear when they're working with x-rays, a film badge that was read once a week. Both of your pocket chambers are totally discharged. Please tell us what kind of samples you're handling, how you're handling them, and how are you going to correct the situation. So I immediately called them, told them, I'm running the counting lab. And I said, all of my background counts are normal. This room is not contaminated. And I don't allow hot samples in here for danger that it would ruin all of it. We'd have to thoroughly clean out everything if it got loose in here. So they said, well, we'll check on you tomorrow. The next day they called me up and they said, well, both of your pocket chambers are totally discharged again. And I said, you better come down here and look. So they came down with little portable, we call them cutie pies, little ion chambers or Geiger tubes. There were two types depending on how hot the sample was. And as they got near my desk, which was up against a wall, the needle started going up and up and up. And I don't know, for 2 or 3 days I had been sitting in a chair being shined on by gamma rays. And they said, you better look at what's going on next door. And next door, they had a very hot sample, and they had carefully built a shield around it of lead bricks. All 3 sides and the top. They had neglected to put any in the back. So it was shining through the wall. But I had another child after that with 1 head. And it didn't show up on me. When I came home from Oak Ridge, I went to my doctor, my family doctor, and he was sure I had radiation poisoning because I had a very low blood count. And I said, honest to God, I said it wasn't radiation, it was the food.
Oh my goodness, what a great video to share. And it does show of the danger of being working around that material if it's not properly shielded. And I'm really proud his children only had 1 head.
Or half of one, perhaps. Well, and I think that also brings up another topic I thought would be fun to bring out, which is the Coryell group's role in the design of the atomic bomb, which is something I think one of the stories that's least publicized about what was done in Oak Ridge. But as they got closer to the Trinity test, Oppenheimer started calling Charles Coryell frantically, saying they needed a very radioactive isotope with a certain type of half-life in order to test the implosion trigger for the plutonium bomb, which later on used polonium in the actual bomb. But Charles said he knew exactly the isotope that would be perfect. It was barium-140, which decays very rapidly into another isotope called lanthanum-140. So by then, Charles had the prescience to design and get the Army to build the hot lab to handle these kinds of things. And so they started frantically trying to produce as large quantities of this barium-140 as they could. And apparently the first tiny sample they sent to Los Alamos didn't have all the remote control, lead-lined hot lab. And so they rigged up a string and pulley system to handle the sample, which was in glass tubing, and they dropped it. And it was so radioactive that they had to take the floor of that lab and bury it in a canyon somewhere. So they finally got together the required amount that Oppenheimer wanted, and they had it all ready to put into a metal cone. I think it was made out of titanium, and it was in this glass tubing, and they poured it out into the core and into the cone, and there was almost nothing there, and they panicked. And they went to get Charles. It was your mother's 30th birthday, and he had taken her out to dinner. So they went to his house and waited till they got home to take him back to the lab. They went and got my dad, who built an ion chamber. And the famous chemist Larry Glendenin was there, and he was the one who figured out that they had washed the tubing out with water, and that had not dissolved the isotope, so they needed to wash it out with acid, which they did. And they then got it into the cone, which they put in a huge lead-lined box and lowered with a winch down onto a flatbed truck. And it was taken to Los Alamos under armed guard. And later on, they produced even 3 times as much of this isotope as was needed. And apparently it also glowed. And Ray caught me on this when he would kindly read my novel to see if there were any inaccuracies. He said, you know, that stuff doesn't glow. And I said, but 2 people who've told them about the incident said it glowed. So I looked it up, and sure enough, that particular kind of isotope does give off a glow. So
Learn something every day, I tell you.
Well, just my mother's birthday, Grace Mary Seeley Coryell, was September 14. So they started on the 14th, but they actually finished on the 18th.
that's
And
right.
Charles's group spread between Chicago and some at Los Alamos, maybe, but Oak Ridge celebrated Barium Day, September 18th. I remember Barium Day talk when I was growing up. Yeah.
So that would have been September 14 and September 18 of 1944.
Or
Yeah. I had never heard that story. That is a great bit of hidden history, Keith.
it's the pinnacle. It's the pinnacle in my mind of the interviews, of the excitement, and the modus operandi was that everybody counted in that group. My father said he practiced what he called Quaker democracy, that they wouldn't make a decision about technical decisions about the building or process decisions like Larry's. And he said that do an experiment and 50 times it had failed, but Henry Levy would persevere and do it, and then it worked. And he said once it worked, it tended to work more dependably after that. But this going back to my mother's contribution, aside from naming promethium, the element 61 that came out of the reactor in the lab.
Now tell us about that before you go on, could you?
Well, I was just going to say that she participated. She was incredibly intuitive. Okay. And when Leslie describes in the novel the dinner interview, it was at the home of the apartment, the house in, the place in Chicago where they lived. And obviously she was present. And Charles had come through Caltech in 3 years and met Don Yost, a chemist who came out when Charles was a sophomore trying to work on a laboratory problem. And he said, call me Don, and shook hands. And so Charles had adopted this warmth and rapport and trust that, and he also, after he got his PhD, went to UCLA and he taught at an innovative school called Deep Springs in Bishop, California, and founded by Nunn, I can't think of his first names, who developed the Telluride copper. He brought electricity to the Telluride copper mine, and there's a Telluride foundation at Cornell. But he was misogynistic, but he wanted to create a school that would develop the initiative of young men, the rough and ready cow handling, riding prowess of the Westerner with the more intellectual academic goals of Eastern education. And so there were a small number of students, but the sense of hands-on collaborative work was that culminated in the Quaker democracy of doing science in the Oak Ridge Project was born in this crucible of warm relations, mutual respect, and willingness to argue for your point of view, that science progresses because of challenges.
Now, tell us how she came to be the one to make the name of the element Prometheus.
Well, remind me of that in a minute. I just wanted to say, Leslie, I've been cudgeling my memory, as Charles said, of your mother's first name because you have a pseudonym in the book.
It was Janet.
Janet. So Don and Janet Schover. And Larry and Jack Marinsky, Larry Glendenin, actually did the work of discovery, but it was in Charles's lab, and Charles said, I felt that they deserved the credit. He was always generous with credit in attribution of intellectual work. And so they had the problem, what to name it. So they went to my mother, Grace Mary, and they said, Grace Mary, we've discovered an element. Will you help us name it? And she said, I got a D in high school chemistry. Refresh my memory. What's an element? Oh, they said, listen, it's irreducible matter. By the way, these are the words of Larry Glendenin.
Okay.
So, she said, I think you're like Prometheus. You've stolen fire from the gods. Mankind may suffer for it.
Oh my goodness.
I went to the bookshelf and got the poem of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Prometheus Unbound. And again, she didn't get the credit for naming it. You know, there's, it's come out, and I think my son worked on the Wikipedia entry to do it, but it's quoted on the back of the book. And then Charles describes it, of course, in the, but I've always been really proud. And in fact, in socio-anthropological history, naming in the human family, naming is a power that has persisted. Apparently, the Greek Furies were the former matriarchs supplanted by the patriarchs, but power of naming is often a feminine power in families, and makes me pleased. She named me. She named the element.
I certainly agree with Julie about, you know, the under-regarded role of women in history, and that's certainly the kind of pre-feminist way of looking at things is certainly a part of fission, and the interaction between the people and the couple. But that story also brings up a couple of really funny stories about Larry Glendenin that my father always told, and Julie was able to expand on one of them, and she knew more than I did. But Larry was a little bit of a cowboy when it came to radiation safety. One story is that DuPont used to hold radiation health safety meetings regularly, and one week.
Groves pressed on him.
Oh, was it Groves? Okay. Well, Charles said in his memoirs that he hated those meetings. And apparently one time they discovered that Larry Glendenin's badge had the least radiation exposure of anyone. And they said, Larry, we want you to get up on the podium here and tell everybody about your radiation safety practices and how you keep your badge so clean. And so he got up and he said, okay, every morning I put on this white coat and I clip on my radiation chambers and my badge. And he clipped them on. And he said, and then I go to the doorway of my lab and I take off my white coat and I hang it on the coat tree, and I go into my lab and work. And of course, everybody was laughing except for radiation safety people.
Yeah.
Well, apparently, he also, when you work with radioactive isotopes in tubes, you're always supposed to use a vacuum bulb, but not a pipette and directly on the tube. Well, he neglected to do that. And one day he got a mouthful of radioactive isotope. And all my dad had told me was, well, they made him go and wash out his mouth for about an hour. But Julie, tell the rest
rest
of
of
the
the
story
story,
that I
yeah.
didn't know.
Well, they put him on display. He sat on a stool, and they would rinse his mouth out and then run the Geiger counter, and people went by and had a look. And of course, the average age in Oak Ridge, this came out in Keith McDaniel and Ray's movie, Secret City, was 29.
Yep.
So there were a lot of young women, and the book, Girls of Atomic City, which I can't produce to show you, but is another wonderful source. There were a lot of young women, and there were many more young men in the community than women. And so that's how Larry met his absolutely sparky, delightful, red-headed Ethel, his wife. Was they caught each other's eye and began dating, but eventually his tongue recovered.
No, that's interesting. It kind of reminds me of an old story. I don't remember who told us this, but they were talking about how things were so much different today than they were then. Whenever there was some kind of radiation exposure, apparently out at the plants, there would be frogs that would get into the swamp, and the frogs were hot, and the frogs would jump across the road, and to move on. And there would be hot spots on the road. They said, back then we just go out there with a truck and a garden hose and spray it down, wash it away. As they say, dilution is the solution. As they say. He said today they'd have to go out there and dig up the whole road and go bury it and put a new road in. So things were.
Well, in fact, Keith, that happened. They had some spillage out of a truck on Highway 95. And if you remember, a few years ago, they had to strip up
Yep.
one side of Highway 95 for a couple of miles,
Yeah.
dig it up, and replenish it. She
Absolutely.
mentioned The Girls of Atomic City.
Yes, that's the first
book, by Denise Keranen, and I highly recommend that book. Keith's heard this, but Denise called me when she wanted to write the book, said, I want to write a book about the women in Oak Ridge. And I said, sure, I'll help you. I'll introduce you to them. Well, I introduced her to one woman, Colleen Black. Colleen did the rest. She introduced her to all the other women that are included in the Girls of Atomic City. And Denise's book has done as much as anything to let people who would not normally have known about Oak Ridge to learn about it. Now, she included not just the stories of the women, which she did a really good job on doing that, but she included a lot about the science as well in the book. So I agree with you. It's one that I highly recommend as well.
Well, I want to bring up another issue, which was related to safety. There was one day Charles was late for a safety meeting, and he attempted to enter the colored entrance of the lab. A guard pulled his gun on him and said, no, you may not enter here. And my mother had a nanny for me, a caretaker, Willie Mae Taylor, I think her last name was, who lived in Knoxville, had 3 children of her own. Willie Mae was just wonderful. And my daughter is an artist and graduate of Carleton. And after sophomore year, she had a trimester in Bamako, Mali, and came off the plane on International Women's Day, March 8th, and said, "Mom, I had such a wonderful time in Mali. I want to go back and I want to take you with me because you're so good in French." And it transpired. She earned money in a bicycle shop, and she gained a scholarship for doing art in Mali. It was part of her formation. And we went, and Mali, Bamako, has the red soil of Tennessee. I remembered being enveloped in Willie Mae's warm arms, dark brown arms. And I remembered too how black faces look so somber. And then when they light up in humor, and there's just wonderful vitality and color contrast. And it just, the one time we went back to Oak Ridge was in 1956. The big thing I remember was it was Elvis Presley, and the teenagers were gyrating in the parks. And but we did visit Willie Mae, and one of her, I don't know, but she's just really. And then, having a baby in winter, there was rationing. There were the Semesto houses were going up. There was huge construction. And my mother, they ran out of coal. So my mother called up, and a black voice answered the phone and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, can you call back in the morning where someone can write down your message? You need more coal." And Rachel Fermi, Esther Samra's book, Picturing the Bomb, it talks about the segregation. The black workers were housed literally in cardboard hutments, or
plywood. They were plywood hutments.
Yeah, and there was a story of one man welding them the stove for the wood stove and a fry pan to cook on. And we have a similar dark side in Hanford here in Washington State, where the scientists and top leadership lived in Richland, and the middle workers lived in Kennewick, and the minority workers lived in Pasco. And so the Tri-Cities are class and racially stratified. So and my father said, we had fair employment signs, and it wasn't observed.
Yeah, actually, they were violating the law because Roosevelt had passed the law that anything regarding the Army could not be segregated, but they totally ignored it in Oak Ridge, and they didn't enforce it. But I know I always was kind of puzzled why my parents, who were very much on the liberal Democrat side, never talked in their Oak Ridge stories about African Americans. It was just not part of the things they told me about. So,
and it was that situation you described very accurately, in that was definitely a part of the segregated South at the time and treated as such. But I must tell you that in 1955, there were 85 students in the Scarborough community that desegregated the high school and the junior high school, becoming the first desegregation of schools in the Southeast. Now, 65 years later, we began to recognize that in Oak Ridge, and we're running an effort now to build a monument to that Scarborough 85. We've also gotten it included in the curriculum for all schools in the state of Tennessee. So while you're correct in describing the segregated atmosphere that existed during the Manhattan Project, I'm proud to add the rest of the story of the Scarborough 85.
definitely, I've read about that too, and that's really important.
Julie, if I might, you have brought some really good information to us. I'm proud of Leslie and the book that she's written, but I'm equally proud to be able to meet you and hear firsthand your stories. Is there anything else that you had planned to share with us that we've not given you an opportunity to tell? If there is, we want to take the time and let you do that.
Well, briefly, I want to honor Leslie's deafness
Oh.
skill in creating a portrait of her parents, her experience as people that we could not know as their children, but in talking about sexual relationships and the day-to-day tensions of a marriage. And it's something I think lots of children are curious about and lots of families don't talk about. And I think this is a gift that she brings from her professional work to her personal. And she and I had talked initially about the lure, the excitement of writing fiction versus the discipline and the quest for knowing history. So I think that Leslie has achieved a very interesting amalgam, to use a chemical term, formed in the crucible of her own experience and life in the novel. So that was one thing I wanted to say. And another thing I wanted that we've alluded to with the video of Don Schover, that the radiation, there was a great gift to the world with the bomb of radiation medicine. And Charles, in that 4-day stretch from September 14 to September 18, 1944, actually dove into, with one other person, they took a swim in a cooling pool. There wasn't a pool for swimming in Oak Ridge, but he did develop a rare cancer, giant cell bone sarcoma, at age 53, I think it was. But he had a knee injury from living in, doing part of his thesis in Munich, Germany at the Technische Hochschule. And he went tobogganing and inadvertently tobogganed into Austria, apparently, but he needed to stop the toboggan. He stuck out his right leg and ran into a tree. And so he had a permanent site of injury in his scar tissue in his knee. And he did develop in the winter after Celia and I married in 65, in the winter of 66, painful knee. And he had a second injury of, he was stopped at a stop sign. He chose a Ford Consul car, and the ignition was right close to his knee. He was hit from behind, hit the car in front of him, and his knee hit the key in the ignition. So he had surgery in April of 66, and it turned out his knee wasn't arthritic, it was needing amputation. And they didn't have consent for the amputation, so the amputation happened a week later. But he had the most courageous attitude, scientific attitude. Mind you, he always counted himself a chemist, not a nuclear chemist or a biochemist. He'd worked on the magnetic properties of hemoglobin, and with Linus Pauling. And so he took a scientific interest in what was going on, as well as personally dealing with the effects. The cancer presented itself as sacs of synovial fluid, the kneecap fluid that enables the knee to move, cushions it, which could be aspirated, but it also presented as golf ball sized tumors in the lung, which had to be excised. And he eventually got down to one lobe left, but he was told he had 6 months to 2 years to live. And he said, I have a rare cancer. There's no statistics. And he lived 5.5 very full years, including found a more sympathetic, respectful attitude at the Pasadena Tumor Institute in California compared to the more traditional, in some ways more rigid treatments in Boston. And thought, well, change careers, change the definition of chemistry. But he died young, and I, 3 years ago, received a letter from a man who'd helped the Feynman family and others obtain a settlement from the Department of Labor compensation for radiation or illness-induced early deaths. And that contributed in a big way to our being able to simplify our life and make a move here in Washington.
Actually, there's a story from the barium production that I think is relevant, and it made me kind of ill reading it in Charles's interviews, because I spent a lot of my career at MD Anderson, the big cancer center here, and I knew that his cancer was probably radiation associated. But when they had to send the bigger sample of barium to Los Alamos, they needed to replace the tubing that the first sample had been in, the glass tubing, because it was all blackened and you couldn't see through it. So they had to break it up and take it out of the container it was in so they could reuse the container, and it was very radioactive. And Charles describes that he got, I think, about 10 of his guys together, and everybody took a couple of minutes to dig that glass out of the container. And he said, whatever my boys take, I'll take double.
Wow. Oh my goodness. What a story. Well, this has been a tremendous opportunity to have the two of you here with us today. Keith, is there any way that if we showed the chat that it would be recorded? Can you pull the chat up so that that link to
it won't be recorded.
It won't. Okay, then we won't bother. That'll be all right. I'll add the link when I post this up. I can do that. Well, again, thank you all so much for being here with us and telling us some really good information that's not well known. And Leslie, I look forward to your book coming out in January of 2026.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, very good.
Thank you. Pleasure to see you all in person.
Good to have you here.
Thank you. Ray, who do we have coming up next?
Our next one will be with Hal Beal. He is on the board of directors of the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he'll be talking with us and sharing what's going on with the museum in Albuquerque.
All right, very good. All right, folks, thanks for watching, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another Hidden History.
Thank you.